Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is James Martin Cole. James, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. As you said, my name's James. I'm with the Austin chapter of Democratic Socialists of America. I'm secretary of Austin DSA. The way that DSA works is that it's sort of a lot of federated chapters. So I can't speak on behalf of the entire organization, except based on how I see it from Austin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, you're speaking on behalf of yourself and your
Right.
experiences in Austin, but you're not like a national spokesman for the organization. So that's going to be our topic today: DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and hopefully this will be kind of like an explainer for people who have never heard of the group before or have heard something about it recently, because it's been more in the news in the past 6 weeks than the past 5 years. And then we'll maybe get a little deeper into some of the issues surrounding DSA. So first off, if someone has never heard of DSA before, what is it?
So DSA stands for Democratic Socialists of America. It's the largest socialist organization in the United States right now, with about, I think we just passed 47,000 members. Here in Austin, we've got a little over 1,000. It's a democratically run organization. The term that you hear a lot is multi-tendency, which just means that there's no one political line that we necessarily adhere to, other than the principles of democracy and socialism, whatever that means to the individuals who choose to join the organization. So there's no one specific line that everyone agrees on, like some of the kind of what they call centralist organizations. But it's an activist organization and an organization of organizers. It's not a separate political party, though sometimes they run candidates. That's not technically true. I'm sorry. Sometimes they work with Democratic Party. Some chapters choose not to work with the Democratic Party, and they do lots of non-electoral work as well.
Mm-hmm. So how long have you been a member of the organization?
I joined the organization, like a lot of members, right before the inauguration of Donald Trump. I think between the election and the inauguration.
Yeah, that's when I kind of became more aware of it. I mean, I think maybe I maybe just heard something about it before 2016, and then I started seeing more about it online, and then it seemed like membership really increased around the time Trump was elected.
Right.
So was it Trump's election the thing that spurred you to join?
Yeah, I think sort of a lot of people became aware of the organization during the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I think like a lot of people, I sort of started following it a lot closer then, and then the election of Donald Trump sort of galvanized a lot of people, myself included, to get more directly involved in DSA. I think there, a few thousand people joined over the course of the Sanders presidency. There was another big bump after Trump was elected, another big bump after the inauguration, and then another huge spike in the last 6 or 7 weeks or so.
Mm-hmm. So when you were you a socialist before you joined, or maybe before 2016?
Yeah, I think like a lot of people who considered themselves socialists, for me that meant mostly like reading and talking to people and being frustrated with the state of politics, but not being organized, in any sort of official capacity.
Mm-hmm. So the thing that has happened in the past 6 weeks to spur DSA recruitment is the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, beating out, I mean, everyone knows about this, beating out Joe Crowley, who was like in the Democratic leadership and had been in Congress for 20 years. And, she's like a young, energetic, enthusiastic person who's very charismatic. And she's a member of DSA.
Mhm.
So what did you think like when that happened the night that she won?
Yeah, it was really surprising, to be honest. I don't know everything that goes on in all the different DSA chapters around the country, but I know some chapters have been very well organized around specific electoral campaigns. I'd seen the video that circulated, her campaign video, and heard a lot about her. And really, like, you think about these super entrenched Democratic Party power brokers, and the idea that a DSA chapter and allied organizations and organizations that they're working in coalition with would be able to get this very young woman to take down one of the major Democratic power brokers in a city that's really solidly Democratic. It was really surprising and energizing, and it's sort of showing how the kind of existing power structures are a lot weaker than we're generally led to believe, and how with intentional organizing and dedicated work, there's serious differences that we can make, and serious impacts we can make on those structures.
Mm-hmm. It was very surprising, and I hadn't heard of her before a couple weeks before this is happening, and I would see retweets of her campaign videos and stuff, and I was like, you can only pay attention to so many things, and I didn't really know what this was. I was like, I don't, I'm not going to focus on this at all, because this like doesn't, this isn't going to be a thing. So I had no idea about her. But yeah, I think it's extra surprising. So I live in Western New York, and New York state politics is super corrupt. Just today, Sheldon Silver, the former speaker of either the state senate or the state assembly, I can't remember, was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And the districts are all drawn. I mean, on the state level, especially, the districts are drawn very favorably for incumbents, and the same people get reelected year after year after year. There's the local political power broker in Rochester is this guy named David Gant, who is either in his late 70s or early 80s, and he's been there like 30 years or more, and he has a personal policy that he doesn't talk to the media.
Cool. Great.
So there's a video of a local reporter going up to ask him about something, and he just says, "I don't talk to the media," and yet he gets reelected,
right,
consistently, and will until he dies, I assume.
Yeah.
So the politics in New York State is very depressing, between the corruption and the entrenched interests continuing to control everything. So it was interesting. And what do you think about the role that she's taken on since her victory? So she's like assured, her district, she's like assured to win, unless something crazy happens. Like she'll be in Congress, and so she's like kind of doing, endorsing other people and kind of doing like barnstorming type things with Bernie Sanders. What do you think about that?
It's incredibly exciting. I mean, I think there's, I like to stress that like the majority of the work that DSA does isn't in the electoral realm, right? But by the same token, we can't afford to ignore that elections are happening, and she's galvanized a lot of, I think, DSA chapters and people who are curious about DSA, but maybe on the fence about actually joining or going to a meeting to get involved. And her, like one of the arguments you hear a lot against socialism or democratic socialism is that, it can work in like New York City and it can work in Chicago, but there's not like a broad appeal for it across the country. And I think Ocasio-Cortez was in Kansas the other day, with Bernie Sanders, and they had rented out one room, but the room sold out immediately, so they rented out a bigger one, and that sold out immediately. And like the people across the country are really receptive to this ideology, and to this kind of political movement, and it's very exciting to see her taking it outside of the areas where the media sort of tells you it can work, into the areas where the media tells you it can't work. And kind of showing that there's an appetite for this kind of politics there as well.
Mm-hmm. So one comparison that political pundits have made is saying that DSA in 2018 and the Democrats is like the Tea Party in 2010 and the Republicans. And, the Tea Party has been wildly successful, although I guess, I mean, their original claimed policy position was mainly around federal debt.
Right.
And so that got worse, but no one really seems to actually care about that.
Right.
But if the policy is just electing very, very conservative people, they've been wildly successful, and there's a number of dozens of people in Congress now who carry the Tea Party mantle. So do you see a comparison here? Is this the beginning of this a kind of counter wave on the left?
There's a really crucial difference between the Tea Party and the DSA. And, I live in Texas where the Tea Party has substantial control over the state government and the people that we send to the federal government. And you kind of touched on it, which is the Tea Party, their stated stance, which is, that this deficit has gotten out of hand and we have to do something about this deficit. Was always fundamentally dishonest, right? They were motivated as much by racial animus towards the president than they were towards actual concern for the size of the deficit. Mm-hmm. And like you said, Tea Party Republicans voted overwhelmingly in favor of Donald Trump's tax cuts. They're a fundamentally dishonest movement, and that's because of where they get their funding sources, right? That in large part, the Tea Party isn't a Democratic membership organization. It's people who are being, the term astroturf gets thrown around, and I think that's fair to use, the Koch brothers or Sheldon Adelson or whichever other sources of right-wing money kind of funded that, and Fox News gave it a megaphone, and it had a lot of establishment support. Whereas DSA is a democratic organization, it's a membership organization where the members sort of dictate the politics of the organization. We're not taking corporate money. We don't have access to a cable news station. And we're also we're doing a lot of work outside of the realm of electoral politics. There are definitely people within DSA who see the point of DSA as realigning the Democratic Party and turning it into a left party, but that's not not everyone in the DSA is sort of united around that. I'm not particularly interested in working to realign the Democratic Party. What we're interested in doing is building a broader democratic socialist movement in which the level of participation is really high. The level of influence that rank-and-file members have is really high over the course and direction of the organization. So it's definitely a comparison you hear a lot. You especially hear it a lot from people who aren't really a part of the organization and don't seem to have a great grasp over how the organization works or what it does. But I do think it's clearly having an effect on some Democratic parties around the country, and it's definitely bringing left ideas and socialist ideas into mainstream discourse.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the non-electoral things that DSA does?
Sure. One thing that sort of has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of chapters have put on free brake lights clinics. Mm-hmm. The idea behind these is that police officers use dead tail lights, brake lights that are out as a pretext to pull people over, and they do this specifically. It's heavily racialized. They do it to harass black people and immigrants, and by doing these sort of free brake light clinics, DSA is trying to provide a service to the community, but a service that's political rather than in the way that a lot of charities and NGOs work. where it's a service, but it's apolitical. It's stepping in where the market isn't effective. We're trying to, I guess, kind of make the cruelty of that system or the inhumanity of it kind of more tangible and bring attention to it. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that we do that's not electoral. There are chapters who are involved in direct action. DSA Portland was really involved in an occupation of an ICE building or the area around an ICE building mm-hmm. that shut an ICE office for a few days. Similarly, DSA members in San Antonio, an hour south of, or hour and a half south of where I'm at right now, are involved in an occupation of an ICE building over there. So there's a real variety of sort of like tactics and strategies that different chapters of the organizations and the national organization, chooses to work on.
Mm-hmm. So why don't we talk about direct action a little bit more? So the other thing that happened in the past month or so that got DSA in the news was this protest of the Homeland Security Secretary, whose name I think is Kirstjen Nielsen, although there's a J in there, so I don't know exactly how it's pronounced. But she was. I was
going to bring that up, but I couldn't. I didn't want to try and pronounce her name until you did it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, Secretary Nielsen was dining. Was dining out at a fancy restaurant, and some DSA members from the Washington D.C. chapter found out about this from someone in the restaurant and went and started, yelling and chanting, and kind of chased her out of the restaurant, and this got captured on video. Mm-hmm. So what did you think about that kind of tactic?
Yeah, I mean that's another sort of tactic that chapters are doing. They're confronting powerful people directly. That's another thing that I think sort of before Ocasio-Cortez had DSA in the media and getting a lot of attention from this sort of like places where traditionally there's not a lot of attention paid to socialist organizations. But I think there's like a there's a barbarism at the heart of what not just the Trump administration, all previous administrations, immigration sort of policy is, mm-hmm. And people are sort of being, I think people are tired of civility or of like calling your congressperson or whatever as the only option that is given to you when you're faced with something as like horrible as family separation and family detention and the detention of asylum seekers. Mm-hmm. So I think people are interested in this sort of action and interested in DSA as an organization that's participating in this sort of action because the kind of ways that are the avenues for legitimate political discourse are so clearly inadequate to the era that we're living in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm kind of like ambivalent about those kind of tactics, and the other famous one was Sarah Huckabee Sanders getting ejected from a fancy restaurant in Virginia by the owner, and that was like that story was like all consuming for like a week. It was kind of crazy, but for something that was not actually a big deal at all. But it allows, so there's a visceral like thrill to see like these awful people who are bullies and are wrecking our democracy, have people shouting at them or have them turned out on the street and have something like shitty happen to them that's like 1/1000th of what they're doing to many other people across the country. But at the same time, it allows them to play the victim. It makes it seem like, they're under siege. It's like Huckabee Sanders did a tweet the next day that was, attracted a lot of retweets from people on the right, making herself to be the, she did nothing wrong and she's the victim of this circumstance. And then it's, and then we're talking about ejecting her from the restaurant instead of talking about the children being separated from their migrant parents. So I can't decide. I think if I saw Kirstjen Nielsen on the street and I could identify her, who she was, I would yell "fuck you" or something like that.
Sure.
But I wouldn't spit on her, I don't think, because that maybe crosses the line. But then at the same time, thinking like, well, we seem to be living in extraordinary times, and we're not sure whether continuing with the ordinary way things are done is going to be enough to change the negative direction. So yeah, right. I guess that's I'm caught in confusion or something.
Sure, and I think like to a large extent the right wing in this country is always going to play the victim. They control the entire government right now. They control a lot of the kind of ideological apparatus of the country in terms of like the media and the churches. They're always going to pretend that it's wealthy people and white people who are under siege in this country, and not working people and people of color. And I don't know that confronting them in a restaurant it really solidifies that argument in the eyes of their base any more than that argument is already solidified. But I think what it does do is they any kind of like powerful person or person in government relies on this on the consent of the governed, and this illusion of authority or illusion of legitimacy. And by confronting these people directly and letting lots of people on the internet or in the media see that these are people just like we are, and that there's no special aura to them, and that being part of the government doesn't make them infallible or give them some kind of divine right to govern. And I think it can be effective in activating people to get organized and participate in, the DSA saw a big membership bump after the director of Homeland Security was confronted at that restaurant. If that sort of thing inspires people to get organized and go further than that and do more, quote unquote serious political work or get involved with an organization and help support an organization that's doing real political work, I think it's a pretty effective tactic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other way this kind of stuff could be effective is like, Huckabee Sanders and Nielsen are not going to be in these jobs forever. Someone else is going to have to take them, and then that person is going to have to think about what their life is really going to be like if people are shouting at them on the street, or they're being ejected from nice restaurants. Do they really want to work in the Trump administration? There's been some stories about the lower level people in the Trump White House who we wouldn't know who they are, who usually you work in the White House for a couple of years and then you move to a sweet gig at a lobby firm or consulting firm or business or something. And these young conservatives are having a tough time getting that job next job after the White House. So that's a very good thing for all people concerned. Yeah. And they need, to keep the government functioning, they need humans in there to do the jobs. And if the pool of people that they're drawing from is the people, intelligent people who just think, I don't need this grief. I'll wait for the next conservative administration that isn't run by a moron grifter to get my job. Then that helps gum up the works of all the bad things the Trump administration is trying to do.
Which is why it's so frustrating to see now that Donald Trump is so nakedly fascist, so nakedly grotesque in his governance, that just see centrists and even liberals sort of rehabilitating George Bush and say, well, we didn't have it that bad in 2003, 2004, and even rehabilitating Bill Clinton and making justifications for the expansion of mass incarceration and the gutting of the welfare state. Really, none of these people should be able to go out and eat at a restaurant in peace. But if if it's just Trump administration officials, I'll take it for now.
Okay, that's a good start. So speaking of the welfare state, is there a difference between democratic socialism and social democracy in the European sense? Because
Yeah.
Sorry, well, yeah, I guess that's the basic question. Like, what, same thing or different thing?
I think definitely a different thing. Like anything else, there's 47,000 DSA members and probably 47,000 different answers to this. But social democratic parties in Europe were a mixture of people who wanted to go far beyond capitalism, and then a right wing of these parties that were concerned with just kind of reforming capitalism or making it more tolerable. And then, gradually as the 60s turned into the 70s and the 70s turned into 80s, sort of abandoned even the goal of reforming capitalism. DSA is an anti-capitalist organization. When we say democratic socialism, we mean democracy, not just in terms of electoral democracy and electing officials, but democratic control of the economy and of production and of society writ large. So we're not, we're not New Deal liberals, even though a lot of the things we're working towards, like Medicare for All, which is one of our big campaigns, are things that you would traditionally associate with liberalism or social democracy. We see these as necessary reforms and the first step to democratizing the entirety of society and production.
Okay, so going beyond the like generous welfare state and like state ownership of some areas that you see in northern Europe and some small other places. Let's talk about Medicare for All. For years this was called single payer, and I thought that was like such a stupid thing because no one understood what that meant. And I didn't when I got to college, like maybe that's the first time I heard of single payer, and I didn't understand it. I was like, why? Like, am I the single payer? Like, I'm like I only pay once or something? It's just like the worst possible name. So I thought universal Medicare should be the term. It's become Medicare for All, which is more or less the same thing. The last giant political fight that like split the country in two was over Obamacare, and this was like a huge, we all remember it. Huge fight. It like barely passed. They had to use these parliamentary tricks to get it finally passed, and then there was a giant backlash. Supreme Court, blah blah blah. It went into effect. There were some mistakes at the beginning. People got mad. More Republicans were elected to Congress. And then it seemed to be like in 2015-16, it seemed to be like, okay, seems to be working, okay, like as it was intended. But also like, anytime you try to pass healthcare legislation, it's like really, really, really difficult. And I, like kind of the center left pundit, I remember like Matt Iglesias wrote a post that says something like, after Obamacare passed, he said something like, well, the American welfare state is complete or something, or like, we're basically done. We can tinker around the edges, but like, it's done. So he was wrong. And yeah, but I guess it's also like, I feel the urgency of doing this, but also it's like our system is so crazy and it's so hard to get anything actually done. And this like quarter-way reform that kept the insurance industry intact and subsidized the insurance industry, like was opposed entirely by the Conservative Party. And since we have all these other problems, like, is this the thing that like should if there's a Democratic president, Democratic Congress, should they like dive back in to do Medicare for All, or should like focusing on something else like climate change, like should that be the focus?
I mean, I'm a big believer in Medicare for All as like probably the most transformational and the most winnable fight for Democratic Socialists to take up right now. Like year after year when they release the end of year polls about what voters' number one concern are, the price of healthcare is always number one, or sometimes just under number one. And a large part of why Obamacare or the ACA was so unpopular is that it didn't really do very much to address that. Right? It expanded healthcare to some people, but created these sort of marketplace plans that were often, not actually usable for the people who had them. I remember a time in my life paying like $163 a month for something that, like the deductible was like $6,000 or $7,000 a year. Copays were enormous, and I was making, I was making like $15 an hour, which is pretty good, and still really couldn't afford to use the healthcare that I had. So it just kind of sat there in case I was hit by a truck or something.
Right.
I never, I don't think I ever went to the doctor on that healthcare. So it's not really healthcare, right? One of the reasons why we think like Medicare for all, which would be truly universal and cover everyone, not just everyone who could afford to pay it, or everyone in a state where they bothered to expand Medicaid, but literally everyone in the country, including non-citizens, would have health care that's free at the point of service. We think that's the sort of non-reformist reform that enormous numbers of people can get behind. Obamacare didn't really have a constituency other than, recent college graduates who could stay on their parents' health insurance for a few extra years. There was no one who felt Obamacare as like a new right or a new guarantee of their well-being.
Well, I would disagree with that part, because people with pre-existing conditions or very, very expensive conditions, so they removed the lifetime cap and made it so you couldn't be charged for pre-existing conditions. So I think, if you, depending on how broadly you define pre-existing condition, it could be like half or more of American citizens who that helped. And, the pre-existing condition thing seems to be like the most popular aspect of it. And whenever there's a challenge to Obamacare, that's the thing that like people rally around, is like, because even people who think Medicare for all would be socialized medicine are discomfited by the idea that if you were born with a congenital disease, you're going to be charged more for it through no fault of your own, and that ailment in particular might not be covered by your insurance. So that, like, everyone agrees that's amoral. Sure. So it accomplished that. But that's
right.
like that's not universal care.
Right. And it's still not necessarily affordable care or care that you can actually use, And then there's still tens of millions of people in this country who have no health insurance at all. It's especially with the sort of like kind of continually rising costs of health insurance premiums. You end up with, especially in like rural areas, just providers leaving the market entirely, so that even if you can afford health insurance, or even if you have a pre-existing condition that is now covered, if the closest hospital to you is 150 miles away, it's really kind of theoretical to say that you have health care. So in our view, Medicare for all, by being truly universal and by eliminating the profit motive from providers, and giving it to everyone, that making it free at the point of service. So whether you have like a sprained ankle or a cancer scare, you don't have to wonder about, well, how sick am I really? How serious is this? Do I really need to go in? Do I really want to spend the $75 or $150 on this copay? You can just go in and get real care that's about making sure you're well.
Would you want something like the UK model of state-employed doctors, or something like the Canadian model that I think is also called Medicare, that is more like just...
So I think
the payment is from the government.
Sure. So the Medicare for all that DSA is asking for it's like a 5-point program that's sort of like there are 5 things that we want out of what we're asking for now. So it's not a national health service style program, although I think probably if you asked 100 DSA members whether they'd prefer the NHS or the Canadian system, 99 or 100 of them would say NHS. But what we're asking for is single payer rather than a fully government owned and run healthcare system.
Okay. Yeah, it seems very, very difficult that it could actually happen anytime soon. Like just I said before, there's the legislative filibuster, there's the Supreme Court, there's all these things that everyone knows about. Why Wyoming gets 2 senators. All these things are stumbling blocks for this ever happening. So I would like it to happen, but
I guess I think where sort of like socialist politics and where DSA in particular sees this as maybe more possible than it seems under the current political reality is if like Richard Nixon desegregated the schools in West Virginia recently. There was this big teacher strike, and a very reactionary state legislature passed across the board raises to not just teachers but all state employees. If there's actually real organized popular pressure, there's the kind of flexibility of what, like the horizons of what becomes possible expands, right? In the United States, in most of my lifetime, very few people are organized and active politically. Unions have been in retreat, and even like the biggest upsurge I can think of is sort of the 2008 Obama campaign, where lots of people flooded into his campaign apparatus. And then once he became president, he sort of dissolved Obama for America, and a lot of the people who got involved were demobilized. What DSA is trying to do, and in conjunction with a lot of other kind of allied organizations, is build a more lasting and deliberately permanent organization mobilization, so that we can actually push people to do things that they're not inclined to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I want to ask about, you said in our conversation before this, you said you didn't know a ton about it, but I'm interested in your perspective on how social media, in particular Twitter, and also the popular podcast Chapo Trap House have affected recent trends in DSA. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know how much or what exactly to say about that. It's definitely, it's hugely popular among members, especially younger members, and a lot of DSA's growth in the past few years has been among young people and college campuses. We have a youth section called YDSA that's really sort of expanded enormously. I think, in my experience, it's not a huge factor in terms of what we do as an organization or what we talk about at DSA meetings. It's definitely a thing that a lot of people are fans of. I know that kind of Twitter culture was big in sort of introducing people to the idea of DSA as an organization that they might want to be a part of. Mm-hmm. But in my view, or in my experience, it doesn't really, it helps people maybe get into the organization, but I don't feel that it has a ton of bearing on what the organization actually does, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And
I'm also old, so I don't know.
I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and you see people with a rose emoji in their display name, or who have DSA in their bio or something, and some of these people talk about organizing efforts they do and stuff like that, and then there's also people who just are more like a normal Twitter person, and that they just want to fight with other people and argue and yell and have fun, dunking on people and stuff like that. So yeah, there's definitely that, and some of it seems basically negative to me. But I mean, what would these people be doing otherwise? Maybe they'd be dunking on people about basketball or video games or something, and they just decided to dunk on people about socialist politics. So
Right.
I don't know. It seems yeah, it's somewhere like a way into the door, but also somewhat of a sideshow
Right.
that some people can get caught up in.
And in the positive side of it is I think that a lot of sort of kind of centrist media authorities, figures like Matt Iglesias, who you mentioned, who I think probably had a lot of cachet during the Obama era, who were maybe putting forward some pretty bad political ideas that were going largely unchallenged among liberals and among left liberals. That stuff is really being challenged now, and the people who are making kind of what I would call bullshit centrist arguments receive a ton of pushback on that, and I think there's probably some value in poking holes through that kind of stuff. Where it gets bad is when it kind of where the kind of Twitter folks kind of start to eat themselves or eat each other. But yeah, there's probably some benefit for it, and I think it's definitely responsible for at least some part of the membership growth.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Iglesias again. I've noticed, I've been reading him, I guess, for over a decade, and definitely in the recent years, like the past year or so, he's been moving further left than he used to be. And I don't know if he is just a savvy guy who put his finger to the wind and decided that the readership and clicks would be more towards the left than towards the technocratic neoliberalism that he espoused in an earlier part of his career, or whether he's had some genuine come to Lenin moment of moving to the left. But yeah, he's definitely he's arguing for he's kind of mimicking some of the things that lefties on Twitter say and do, and seems to be arguing for more far left policies than he would have 3 years ago. So, when Ocasio-Cortez won, you saw a reaction among some conservatives of being like, socialism? Don't you know that Stalin killed 20 million people? And you continue to see that online. There was a tweet just from yesterday that is a more intelligent version of that, and this is from a guy whose name is Kevin Wynn. I assume that's how you pronounce his last name, and he's an editor at GQ. He tweeted, "White people need to get less angry when I tell them my parents fled communism." So what do you think about that? This, the critique is the Soviet Gulag murdered thousands, and Stalin was very bad, and we know what happened in other countries that were ruled by communism. And what do you see as the connection between democratic socialism and the communism of the 20th century?
Sure, I'm not gonna make apologies for the excesses of communist organization or communist governments in history, but it is it's a little grating how the atrocities that happen under these historical groups are attributed to the economic and political form, but the sort of the era we're living under right now is incredibly brutal, right? Like family separations and mass incarceration are terrible atrocities that we as socialists attribute in part to the capitalist system and to the capitalist state. And I don't know that it's reasonable to attribute we're not a Stalinist organization. We're not for the most part, a Marxist-Leninist organization. There's certainly people in the organization who are maybe bigger proponents of that style of socialism than I would be, and I don't want to speak for them. But I think my response to that sort of criticism would be to highlight the continued atrocities of capitalist regimes and like European colonialist regimes and imperialism still going on now, and kind of like, you know, I don't want to downplay the idea that this person's family had to flee, but there are families fleeing places around the world that the United States is intervening in, or has a hand in destabilizing, and that's as much a result of capitalism as, you know, the excesses of Stalinism are a result of socialism or communism.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote an essay that you posted on Medium, and we'll link to it, called An Electoral Strategy for Austin DSA, and it was kind of split in multiple parts, but the first part was kind of your analysis of like whether, like, how DSA should interact with the Democratic Party. And I thought it was interesting and has applicability, you know, beyond Austin DSA. So can you kind of outline that argument?
Sure. I think like in like probably one of the most contentious arguments in DSA chapters across the country, and certainly in Austin DSA, is exactly how we should think about and work with the Democratic Party. The historical DSA, the DSA, let's say the pre-Bernie DSA, was very invested in kind of realignment strategies and working through the internal bureaucracy of the DSA and trying to move, the internal bureaucracy of the Democratic Party and trying to move the Democratic Party left. DSA gets its start in 1982, and it has a couple predecessor organizations, one of which is DSOC, which gets its start earlier, and they're really involved in trying to move the Democratic Party to the left and turning it into like a broadly European-style social democratic party with like a committed group of socialists at the very left of it who are dictating or helping influence a lot of the Democratic Party direction. In my view, and I want to stress this is really just my view and not not Austin DSA's view or DSA, the national organization's view, but in my view, there's some really hard limits to what you can accomplish within the Democratic Party, because in addition to elected officials and sort of like the internal party bureaucrats, you know, or even internal party activists like you know, precinct chairs and heads of state Democratic Party committees and things like that you can kind of contest for power within, like, you know, within a democratic structure. You know, you go to the state convention and you nominate yourself for this and say, I'm a socialist and I think you should put a socialist in charge of the rules committee, and you either win or lose. But in addition to those, there's an enormous amount of kind of external pressures to the Democratic Party, you know, specifically a wealthy donor class that's sort of around like the finance industry and the tech industry and the entertainment industry and the healthcare industry, that put really hard limits to what Democrats are allowed to do. And part of how they do this is by, you know, like there are groups like the Center for American Progress, which is a group that isn't democratically elected, but has an enormous amount of influence over the direction of the Democratic Party. And there's a whole litany of alphabet soup groups that I'm not going to be able to come up with off the top of my head that do similar things. And there's a lot of millionaires and billionaires who give lots of money to these organizations, and in exchange for that get to sit on the boards of these organizations or make suggestions or appointments to the boards of these organizations, and influence their policy and their political orientation, and those groups in turn have an enormous effect over the Democratic Party. So like if we as DSA endorse someone who says they're a socialist, and you know, we go out and we knock on a bunch of doors and we hold a bunch of events, maybe we raise a little bit of money for them and we get them elected, and they take their place in Washington, all of a sudden, all of these other structures, these other forces, can put their money and influence. They can bring it to bear on these elected officials. So I'm skeptical of realignment strategies and of trying to like move the Democratic Party to the left. I think DSA's work should be towards movement building and building a socialist movement and creating a resilient and independent democratic socialist of America that uses the Democratic ballot line strategically. Like Ocasio-Cortez, right? She's not a Democratic Party insider. She's going up against a Democratic Party insider. I think you're seeing a little bit now that like making sure that she sort of adheres to our values and continues to adhere to our values as she enters Washington is going to be a difficult task. And I think we need to build the socialist movement and the strengths of our own organization if we're going to be serious about doing that task.
It's a very interesting problem, and you lay it out well, and I encourage people to check out the essay. And just to mention Matt Iglesias again, he used to work for the Center for American Progress. He was a blogger there,
sure.
Around 2008, 2010. So yeah, I mean, I think we're so this is like what it seems like from how I'm understanding you. You are not endorsing like a Tea Party type model where we can say that like the Tea Party came and took over the Republican Party like a, bacteria infesting a host or something. And now they have their congressmen are running committees and have powerful roles. And, Trump isn't like, you can't really put him in Tea Party because
right.
he doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't really believe anything, but he has broadly
right.
similar outlook and he's a racist and, et cetera, et cetera. So you basically say like that can't happen with the Democrats because it's a much more diverse coalition, and there are socialists can't take over the Democrats because there are a number of very, very wealthy people who are intrinsically opposed to socialism, who are connected to the Democratic Party through fundraising and the think tanks and the elected officials like cash out after they leave office and they go work at in some job where they can make a lot of money. Is that am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, and to go back to the Tea Party example, like the Tea Party was very acceptable to the donor class of the Republican Party, right? In large part, it was funded and they have their own network of think tanks that were funded by the same people who fund traditional Republicans. Whereas I think socialist politics are really unacceptable to, say, the financial industry, right? Mm-hmm. And the financial industry's ability to influence the Democratic Party, both through direct donations to candidates, but also through, this network and web of think tanks and liberal NGOs and charity organizations, political staffers, political consultants, the whole like broad cloud that surrounds the Democratic Party and that makes it work. I think if we want to be serious about realignment politics, we have to think about how we're going to displace those groups. And I think a Tea Party model would not allow us to do that. So I wouldn't advocate a Tea Party of the left style strategy, but there are definitely people within DSA who do think that that's a workable strategy and who are definitely doing work in that direction. All committed organizers and are, they're having some degree of success in some ways and some failures in other ways. And, I think the only way we're going to figure out what the general orientation of DSA is going to be in the years to come is by having these political arguments and making democratic decisions, as DSA among our membership.
Mm-hmm. I think that sounds like a good place to end things. Do you have anything else you want to say before we wrap it up?
Join DSA. That's pretty good. It's also like it's a like the culture within DSA is pretty good. There are definitely people. There are definitely arguments, and we're not a perfect organization, but it's a well-run organization. Chapters around the country make it easy for people to join and get involved and get to know people within the organization. And we're definitely not going to beat capitalism, and we're not going to beat Trump unless we're legitimately organized. And I think DSA is probably the place to do that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from what I've heard about DSA, it does have this like social component that I almost like harken to me. It sounds more like something from like the 1950s of like Elks Club, like almost. It just like we live in a much more atomized society than 50 years ago, and here's like a place where like-minded people can get together that isn't the internet.
Right.
That part has appeal. So James, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me and our listeners and viewers. Are you on Twitter? I can't remember.
Let's say no.
Okay, not on Twitter. But if you want to learn more about the DSA, I assume it's DSA.org. Is that right?
DSAUSA.org.
Okay, so
there's a direct selling association that I think has a beat to the website.
Oh, okay. Well, that's capitalism for you.
Yeah.
So so check that out, and links will links to all these things mentioned will be below. So thank you, James. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. We'll see you again next time.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Bye.